Hey, John.
Yeah.
I think the syllabus says that analysis paper is due on the 25th. It's changed to the 30th now.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
You can submit it on the 25th if you'd like, if it's
Okay.
finished and you want to get it out of the way. Okay, good morning. I hope you had a good weekend. So, okay, today we'll talk about the Galato reading a little bit, and then pragmatics and language teaching, and then a little bit about going back to something that was introduced earlier in the term emic and etic research. And then Wednesday, there is a reading on complement responses in Arabic. And we'll also talk a little bit about closing sequences on Wednesday. And there is no class on Friday because of the holiday. And your papers on the syllabus, it does say the 25th. But if you want more time, you can take until Monday. So have you got questions about stuff like this? Syllabus stuff? Or other things, I guess. So I've talked with a couple of you about your second papers, and I'll be happy to talk to you if you've got questions about the direction or analysis or scope, too big, too small, all those kinds of things. Just let me know when you want to talk about it. And okay. So we're not going to break up into small groups for this, like I said last time. And these are some ideas that I had about the Galato reading to maybe as a starting point, but I don't want to give a summary of it or just talk too much about it, but I'll be happy to answer clarification questions or offer my comments to your comments, etc. So the floor is open. And if people are sending questions or comments on the chat, will somebody please look at it and articulate it or let me know? Because I want to attend elsewhere.
In the introduction or in the method somewhere, it was said that like CA was chosen as if there was like some other way to analyze the data. What way were they like referring to that is another way to analyze that kind of data?
Well, that's a great question. Some of you have taken other analytic classes and you may have ideas different from mine, but can anybody conceive of different or know of different methods for doing this kind of analysis of complement responses? How you might go about doing something like this?
Wasn't the whole critical linguistics a thing, like studying the relationships between the compliment giver and the compliment receiver?
Sure. Yeah, you could focus on identity, power relationships. You know, I guess Bree's question was about this data in particular. Probably when they collected this data, they probably didn't have that information. So then you have to be, you know, the data is collected for your particular research question. So yeah, some people would be interested in a critical angle to all of this. Well, so how would you get at that? To do a critical linguistic analysis of complement responses?
You would have to collect more data about the participants and their relationship and the context. Maybe include some interviews with them to get a better understanding of like their more implicit aspects.
Mm-hmm.
I guess if it helps, also part of my question was like, because their age range is so broad, it seems like there would be, like, I don't know, it's hard to like take out the age aspect, because like in my situations, people that are older don't use as many like compliments to people that are younger because of like the power dynamic there. And so I was like, how do they not take that in account in the data?
Good. That's also a great addition to the question. Yeah. So how would this researcher respond? I think you know enough about this approach or conversation analysis to have an idea of how she might respond. Like, okay, wide age range. We have a feeling from personal experience that different ages complement differently. So why would a researcher do something like this?
Maybe if they saw that happening, that could be a portion of their discussion, but maybe because I didn't pay attention to the ages. I don't know if they were stated in there, but maybe they just didn't see that happening with their participants.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The ages were 23 to 70, just in case.
So you could potentially, for the data you have, you could divide it up and have subsets and say, okay, this group, these interactions were younger people, these interactions were older people. And a lot of analysts do that. So collect lots of data at one particular time. This is kind of called a cross-sectional approach. And then you can divide it up by all different kinds of aspects, demographic aspects, including age. But I think that's not what Galata would be interested in, the division of ages.
Are you suggesting that perhaps Galata was more interested in the format of these complements instead of the power dynamics between the people?
Yeah, definitely. What are the structural or linguistic actions used? And I think also the assumption is that the data were collected from German speakers, that this is representative of the German language, whatever that is. So first of all, you have to believe there are such things as languages. and that they can be divided up like that, the German language. And that, she also might say, well, I'm trying to represent all age groups of German language speakers. So it's a legitimate question and a legitimate possible criticism, like how representative are the data of the language? Which also then raises another question. If you don't think it's representative, how would you get representative data for the entire language?
I have a question, because it did say that it was a standard German.
Okay.
But do people have dialects over there? I believe so, yes.
Yes.
I don't know. Like, did they add that into their data?
This is there is no easy answer to this question. So first of all, what is a language and what is a dialect? Not an easy question to answer. So yes, all languages have varieties, an infinite number of varieties. So yeah.
I'm sorry. In the paper, it mentioned that they had dialects from all over the country that were represented. So I think maybe they were talking about standard German as opposed to like Swiss German.
I think they were talking about, German as spoken in Germany. I guess that's kind of an attempt to cover the bases, to say this is representative in some way. But I mean, you can think of yourselves and think of the claims made about English too. We're all speakers of English. So there were certain generalizations made about the way complement responses are done in English. That is American English, according to the paper.
I feel like it's worth noting that there's not that much study on it too, on German. So I think, and they kind of talked about like they have a smaller corpus. So I think that is kind of, they tried to build that in at least.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So definitely, probably the first study on German complement responses, at least using this approach, but not much research in general. So it's a starting point.
I have a comment now. Sorry. So I will assume, just because of the regions of German and English, people will take compliments differently.
You assume that?
Yes.
Okay. So what do you think about Daniela's assumption?
I agree.
So what does that mean? So what does that mean for this research? Does this research seem to take it into account or not take it into account, or what do we do with that understanding that people respond to compliments differently?
But I mean, the difference in which people respond to compliments was like marked because they have the different categorizations for how people responded to compliments.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, right, there are these two preferences and there are different types of responses, accepting, rejecting, or trying to address both preferences. So those things happen, and they're, for the in-between category, the addressing both preferences, there were like 8 different types within there, 8 different examples. But I don't know if that still addresses the issue of variation by region of the country. What they're suggesting is that this represents the German language. A standard German language. And I'm just proposing that these are not easy generalizations to make, because first of all, the division of who's a speaker of what and who's a speaker of what variety are not easy to make.
I thought about this as well when in English, how I think it's pretty regionally specific. A lot of times out here on the West Coast, we say no problem, no worries. And a lot of people don't like that from either other areas or different ages. And that's probably not represented in a lot of data as like a standard, but that's regionally here, and that's just in one language.
Mm-hmm.
And they can make people really mad too. I worked at Joanne's, and some people really did not like hearing no problem or no worries.
Wow, I did not know that. I think an appropriate response would be no problem.
This is why I mentioned my comment, because I came from Maryland, and when I got to Portland, it was not the same. It's more polite here than on the East Coast. So I was maybe trying to put together the article that we just read, and maybe that's how it affects the different kind of compliments, or how people take compliments in Germany, depending on where they're from. Yep.
I mean, this raises these are good questions to think about for possible future research questions. Like, okay, if there are observations that there is variation in different parts of a country, then somebody should collect data and try to figure out, how is it done in different parts of the country. But that immediately, some of you have had sociolinguistics. How do you start delimiting, who it is that speaks representative of a certain part of the country? It's really difficult. Okay, how you were born and raised, let's say, in this person born and raised in Maryland. Okay, what part of Maryland? What other varieties is this person a speaker of? So, how do you separate region from other racial or ethnic varieties of a language? That's very difficult. So then we get back to saying, okay, so let's just lump it all together and just say it's all German, it's all American English.
I have a question that's kind of outside of this article, but still has to do with like politeness.
Okay.
Have there been studies on appreciation tokens, like when people say thank you and when they don't? like a regional thing here in the Northwest. When people get off a bus, they say thank you to a driver, but in other parts of the country, they don't.
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't really know just about appreciations. So that, yeah, I mean, it's hard to. So let's say from a conversation analytic perspective, it would be easy enough to do because you could just go through all of the data that's available and lump it together and say, okay, let's just start looking for appreciations. But then there are context specific things like that, getting off the bus. So you're never going to see that in just a database of naturalistic conversation. So then a researcher would want to go out and target the data collection and say, okay, I'm going to record, you know, things that happens on the bus or something like that, other places. So yeah, I don't know of any studies like that particularly. I think for that reason, it's hard to talk about. It's hard to capture naturalistic data and know something about the people who are uttering it. So like all these people getting off the bus, how many people say thank you? How many people don't say thank you? Then would you have to run after them and give them a questionnaire to find out where did you grow up or something like that? So the quantitative aspect of it would be easy enough, but then to figure out, you know, why it is that they say that, that's a much harder question.
Thank you.
I have a question related to compliments and kind of as a general. Is there studies that encompass like when a compliment isn't wanted? Because I felt like these were all just like people who know each other, or like if not even just unwanted but unusual, like.
Well, I guess, yeah, I think maybe if you're not together with a group of friends talking, maybe you're, you know, in a service encounter or on the bus or somewhere in public, I think it's like more likely you would get a very unusual kind of compliment. So these were all examples of people in a, you know, like you collected data, people you knew, conversational data. So I guess the assumption is that there weren't a lot of unusual types of compliments, or maybe they just kind of tossed those out or treated them as unusual and we're not going to include those in the corpus. Well, I have an outline of the differences, but before I go to that, I'd like to have one more comment or question about the reading. See where that leads us.
I was wondering if you could clarify response pursuit marker on page 558. Yeah,
Tell me what page that was on.
page 558.
Yeah. So pursuing a response. Response pursuit marker, Jefferson, 1980. So it would be a kind of response where, a kind of marker where you are persuading somebody else to respond. So you can, you know, like think of a situation where you ask a question, somebody gives an answer, and then that's not enough. That answer is not enough. So you can do some work to pursue a more expanded response or another response, something like that. In this example, yeah, there's something that follows this, what do they call it? This super right that pursues more talk. Response pursuit marker. You know, you can do this non-verbally, like, you know, I don't know, nodding your head or something like a non-lexical marker, like, huh? You know, like, tell me more. So that's a good kind of terminology that you can use in your own analyses if you see something like that happening, somebody who's, you know, in pursuit of more talk.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Let's, okay, so yeah. I'm just gonna go here. So this was kind of a helpful layout to show the differences when she got towards the end. Like that in American English, the overwhelming kind of response is an acceptance, like thank you, appreciation token. But then she didn't see that happening in German. So here's a big difference. So she said that there are, you know, these types are the same for English and German, but the way the types are done are different. So it's not that Germans don't accept compliments, but they don't accept them with appreciations. So if you were learning German and you were interacting in German and learning how to respond to compliments, and your dominant language is English, American English, I guess the research suggests you're likely to say thank you. But that would sound unusual in German. Rather, you would say something like in German, that's nice. So you know, she calls it an assessment of the compliment, that you assess the person's compliment. That's nice for you to say that. And then, you know, in American English, this idea that you agree with the compliment assertion. Somebody says that was a really tasty meal, and you say something like, I liked it too. That's not something you would hear often in German. But this direct agreement or confirmation with the compliment, yes, in German. You don't see that in English. Or this, you know, like upgraded assessment plus, you know, this marker to get somebody to say some more talk, the receipt pursuit. Super, right? So the idea is in the database that she analyzed that you wouldn't see these things in English, and these two you didn't see in German. But the first thing I think about when I see that is like, well, I don't know. Doesn't sound so unusual to say some of these things in English. So I question sometimes the data that were collected, or if more data needs to be collected, or if newer data needs to be collected. So this is one of a criticism that is now being made about conversation analysis, is that there was a kind of a lot of baseline assumptions that were made about the way interaction works, and that those assumptions are based on data that are now 40 years old, or sometimes 50 years old. And I think for conversation analysts, it hasn't been, at least those who are not linguists, they haven't faced the question of, well, language changes, so how long are we going to keep basing our assumptions about the way language works on data that were collected 40 or 50 years ago? So for those of you who are planning to go and be academics, that's positive news that you can't rely on the analysis of old data if language is changing. it would suggest that new data needs to be collected and analyzed to see like if these old baseline assumptions are correct. What else? This idea of upgrading and downgrading, I think, is also an important concept. So we talked about, last time and the time before when we were talking about that conversation among the people assessing herring and then offering herring and then giving warnings. So we talked about there being assessments and then kind of upgraded assessments. So a different strength to them. So you can assess something and then maybe you're going to make a second assessment that would be more effusive or more intense. So I think in your own analyses, it's important to think about different actions like that. If you want to say they're doing the same action, or it's a similar action, but it's upgraded, or it's downgraded. So that's the most delicious pie I've ever eaten. Yeah, it was a good pie, that's definitely a downgraded assessment from it was fantastic to good. So there are different levels of actions that can be done. I thought her article was interesting too, because they don't often start like that, but she talked about just anecdotal evidence about how complementing behavior in German and English, and what she'd heard about it, and what some of her students or people that she knew talked about. And then she said, well, okay, let's, German people, she said, German people report that they feel uncomfortable when there's a compliment and that they don't respond in a positive manner. But she said, well, actually, that's not true. So people say that they do things that they don't actually do. And then she did another study just of that particular issue, like what do people say they do and what do they actually do? Okay, so let's move on and continue with the discussion about pragmatics and language teaching learning that we started last time. And, this is having a cross-cultural study or cross-linguistic study like the German and English one is a good thing to consider when you're thinking about, okay, teaching a language and what kind of basis, what kind of research basis do you have and do you use for the decisions you make about language teaching? So that's one of the reasons why, for those of you who are planning to teach, that there are courses like this offered and other linguistics courses, because the assumption is that if you're teaching a language, you can't rely on a book to tell you how to teach the language. You have to rely on what you know about the language and about how language works in order to make decisions about what and how you choose to teach it. So last time we addressed some difficulties, like what are possible difficulties if you're teaching pragmatics and teaching people to learn pragmatics in a language. So these are some of my ideas. So the difficult thing that we just pointed out in this article is, well, maybe not everybody compliments or receives compliments like this. So how do you go about teaching a student to do a compliment? You give them, I guess, the most general, widely held way to do compliment behavior. So in a lot of methods for language teaching, language gets reduced, kind of distilled to this kind of essence or some sort of some sort of standard way, or the assumption is that it's the standard variety that's being used. It doesn't have to be that way, but that's often how textbooks treat a language. So I would say I would warn against that idea of like that, this is the way you do this in this language, because there is widespread variation. So it's important that students know there's widespread variation. Yet the students will want to know what should I say? You know, what language should I use? So you have to say something as a teacher. And especially when there are things like high stakes interactional practices that, you know, would affect the students' ability to interact in the language culture. So when there are high stakes things like politeness behavior, I think probably in classes you've had, your teachers have said, okay, this is the most polite. When you have to use some sort of linguistic action, like a compliment or a compliment response or an invitation or an offer, any kind of thing like that, you should err on the most polite side, because in most cases, as a learner of a language, you're not going to, your face will not be threatened if you're using the more polite form than the less polite form. I guess so. I think those kinds of issues students need to know about. There's also this, you know, danger of something like a monolingual bias. So in some of the readings that we've done, the writers will talk about the baseline data as being from whatever, American English speakers. And sometimes then they'll even contrast that with people who have learned the language as a second language. But they don't call the people who have learned the language as a second language a multilingual person. So there's a kind of underlying uninvestigated in a lot of research in pragmatics and conversation analysis, that the baseline is this monolingual person who only knows one language and one culture, and that's what you would teach. And any variation from that is that person is somehow not part of the baseline. So if often somebody who's a multilingual person is not treated as the baseline native speaker of the language. So that's another thing to be, it's part of this idea of the cultural reductionism, like how much can you reduce language to one thing or a manageable package that then you can present to a student to say, this is what you should learn. Because as a teacher, you don't want to just say, well, you know, you just have to figure it out for yourself. You know, go out there and collect some data and do a little analysis, see what people do, and that's what you should say. So this other difficulty about teaching pragmatics is the appropriate contextualization, and this came up in your questions about the reading. So how old are the people I'm talking to? Or how well do I know the people that I'm talking to? Or, you know, where am I when I'm supposed to say this? It's really difficult to do that if you're teaching somebody in a classroom, like to have the appropriate context available, because you can write it all down and say, okay, this is exactly the context, and then you say this in that context. but it's still difficult then when people actually have to go out and start using it to be able to do the contextual analysis and then figure out what to say. So I think as a teacher, if you know these things and you can present these difficulties to students while you're teaching pragmatics, that's the most important thing. So people know there is going to be variation and that we're taking spoken language and we're putting it into writing, okay, and then talking about how you use it in the spoken form. That's already a strange kind of reduction. So do you have questions or comments about this slide or these ideas?
This just kind of reminds me about what we talked about in methods and like doing material development, where the closer you get to authenticity and actually showing real pragmatics, I guess for lack of a better term, real pragmatics, makes it harder to like teach or develop a material, if that makes sense, to an ESL classroom, especially depending on their level. So it's a balancing act between like authenticity and like a clear lesson.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, you know, you can't just, you're not just going to give them a script. Here, just say that. Or do you? Yeah, there has to be some starting point. I mean, yeah, and it all depends on what you're comfortable with as a teacher too. So clearly, you know, some teachers are more comfortable with just saying that everything's more just complicated and you have to figure it out on your own. And other teachers are less comfortable with that. So communicative language teaching, which a lot of people would say that they're doing now, suggests that learners should be interacting in a meaningful way in order to develop language. So similarly with pragmatics, and pragmatics is probably the most important because pragmatics is about language use. So if you want to teach pragmatics, it seems important that you have to have learners in a classroom who are using the language in a meaningful way. So the first question is, how do you get learners to use the language in a classroom? Well, you know, some strategies, you have small groups. And then the next question is, how do they use it in a meaningful way in a classroom? And that's very difficult because it's in a classroom. So people have to, you know, create scenarios or kind of do, you know, pretend that it's in another context if it's in the classroom. And another idea is then to move people outside of the classroom and have contexts that are more meaningful. Not always, that's not always available. It's not always an option though, that's available. So there are a couple of studies recently that do something like that, getting people out of the classroom, but it combines being in the classroom and being outside of the classroom. So in Finland, Purainen, Marsh, and Lilia started this program that's pretty widespread now in their classes, that they have students do a lot of analysis work, and they do the they collect, not only do the analysis, but they collect the data from themselves and do the analysis and then bring their analysis and talk about their analysis in the classroom. So in this particular study, they had students they were students at a university. So they did service encounters like going to the library or cafeteria, ordering food, ordering coffee, getting information some places at the university. And the students went out in small groups and they recorded one another doing these interactions. So video recorded them. And then they transcribed the videos that they did, and they did some analysis, and then they brought that to class and they talked in small groups about those interactions. So in that way, the context was, it was a real world context. It was a meaningful, authentic context because this was part of their everyday life, going, you know, doing things that university students do. And so it was taking their interaction from outside the classroom and bringing it into the classroom and working on it. A similar study has been going on in Iceland for quite a while, where L2 learners of Icelandic as a second language use audio recordings and record themselves in all kinds of different interactions. And the university set this up in the town. They contacted a number of businesses and said to them, like, okay, we've got students who are learning Icelandic, and when they come into your business, we want you to speak Icelandic with them, not switch to English or some other common language. So they had to do this in cooperation with businesses. But they did that, and then the learners did audio recordings and similar process, transcribed and analyzed and brought it to class and worked out the problems and saw what they should and should not say to get accomplished what they wanted to get accomplished in particular situations. So in that sense, it's learner driven. It's also authentic because these are things that the learners themselves were doing every day. So they encountered all of these issues, like what variety, you know, what's the context, what's the age difference, what other identity factors are important, and then figured out what was appropriate at that particular time. And then, okay, then we had the openings. So the study that we read for last time was about in a classroom, the Hoot and Telegani Nikasm, and they focused on how do you open a conversation, how do you open a telephone conversation? So that was based on conversation analytic research, again, from the late 60s. But the baseline research showed there is such a kind of a universal start to a telephone conversation. Well, this was a landline conversation. The phone rings, that's a summons. Okay, that still works for not landline conversations. And the person responds. Okay, so there's a summon response at the start of a telephone conversation. Nowadays, people don't have to say hello because they know who's calling often, so they can start with something else. But still, there's a summons response sequence. So that's a basic telephone opening. You know, this is one example. Phone rings. R says, I was just going to call you. Sure you were. Yep, So how are you doing? Good, how are you? Great, yeah. So what are you all up to today? So the summons, telephone ring, and the response by R, okay, basic sequential structure. And then we have this kind of joking thing, a little pause, and then we have, how are you doing? Good. How are you? Great. Hopefully it doesn't sound too unusual. This is a US mobile phone conversation collected in the last 10 years. Another one, telephone rings. Hi, Hey, how's it going? Oh, not bad, just hanging in there. Your bangs look good today, thanks. I just took a hair mask out. Da, 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 da. So a visual component, not without visual information. So also something that needs to be accounted for, unless we just talk about these things as not being telephone conversations anymore, or I don't know what you call these. No, we're not going to go into this, but different languages, there are different ways of opening. So Korean has like an extended opening sequence that people have to learn. What's this one? Yeah, this one, this explicit orientation to being recorded. Thanks so much for doing this. Yeah, no problem. Is it recording right now? Yeah, it is. That's a little unusual. Okay, so in telephone conversations, there are three general moves. So there's the summons response, mutual recognition, identification, and then some sort of transition into a first topic. And in English, this is often part of this transition into the first topic is, how are you? Fine. How are you? Fine. So this exchange of the how are you sequence. And that's what this shows, you know, how's everything? Pretty good. How about you? Just fine. And then the reason for the call. And then the authors note that in German, this is done a little differently. So you've got the telephone ringing, summons response, and the response is to say your name. And then there's identification, greeting, and then there's no how are you? Fine. How are you? Fine in German telephone call openings. So that is a difference between English and German. Then they get right to the reason for the call. So what Hoot and Talagani Nikazem did, they had talked about with their students, how do you do this in English? And then had data from the two languages and had their students analyze the data so they could see similarities and differences using video when possible or audio recordings. And then they practiced these sequences. So they did use some kind of a script. And they talked about the cultural import. And then they showed the pre-instruction phase. You got the learners of German, phone rings, the person who picks it up says hello, and the person who calls says hello, and then the person who picked it up says good day. Good day. How are you? I'm fine. How are you? Not particularly well. So they do the how are you sequence in German. Okay, so direct transfer from their English practices into the German language structure. Now, this is perfectly understandable to a speaker of German. It's just that if you're interacting with somebody who's not accustomed to English language practices, it might be a little off-putting. And, you can say that's not the way Germans do it. So if you're speaking German, you should do it the way Germans do it. So after they did the instruction, they showed the example where, sure enough, phone rings, person picks it up, says what their name is, the other person identifies, and then there's just one. How are you? Fine. And then they get right to business. What are you doing Saturday? So there, students get an A for that assignment because they did it the right way. So this suggests that the teachers gave them a script and they learn the script and then, they get an A. Everything's fine. But I think the important part for this is the analytic part that happened before it. So they raised students' awareness of how it is that speakers of the language do things in with actual language data. So first having them analyze it to see how it works and reflect on it and to talk about the differences, and then to practice it, and then get positive results. So presumably you could do this not just with telephone opening practices, but all kinds of other recurring language practices, like service encounters or ending a conversation. We'll talk about that next time. Okay, so before I get to the Etic part, have you got comments or questions about teaching, issues for teaching pragmatics? Or do you have experience of learning pragmatics somehow in some language that was particularly helpful or memorable?
When I was learning American Sign Language, we would have to go to like deaf events, and part of that is to like kind of understand more of the culture, but in that as well as more pragmatics, and that was felt like a really good way to do that. Obviously, it's not really always possible for every language.
So what did you do? You just observed and made notes or something?
We like interacted. It kind of depended on the event. Some are just like chat nights. One I went to was like a painting night where we all painted the same picture and stuff. So that was like partially observing, but also participating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good example too of having some activity, some reason to get together to be interacting is important. Okay, so methods. So this came up because I thought about this because we talked about it earlier in the term, but then in the Taligani in Nikasm, Hoot and Taligani Nikasm paper, they mentioned a study done by Galato where she investigated people's use of language and what they say they use language. And she did this study to advocate for using more naturalistic data for language analysis. So that's these conversation analytic methods, you can call it data-driven. And the Emic perspective of it is that you're getting the insiders, participants' perspective on the language. So Emic studies often focus on the process rather than the product. So how it is that things are getting done. And this kind of research is described, so data-driven and theory building often go together. So we're not starting with a theory and hypotheses and trying to disprove hypotheses. It's more exploratory, descriptive, looking at the process, understanding the people's their own understanding in order to, in the future, be able to build some kind of theory out of all of the description. So in a lot of, so the strength is that it's real language data. So this is called ecological validity. So that is the idea is that the data are valid because it fits into an ecology. So it's not, it's not like done in a laboratory where people don't talk about buying ice cream in a laboratory. They talk about buying ice cream when they're buying ice cream. So that's gives it that aspect of validity. So and then we can see the processes and then the strength, hopefully, that we can uncover the interpretations of the people, not just our own, that is the analyst's interpretations. And that's this next turn proof procedure that we talked about. So there are obvious weaknesses to this. A lot of people criticize conversation analysis because of the lack of a historical perspective, that is not understanding people, the participants, their history, their identities, and how that plays a role in the interaction. There's also a lack of control. So let's say you want to do a study on complement responses. Well, you have to collect a lot of data in order to get a particular action. And if you're just collecting data without any kind of elicitation, any kind of prompt, you never know if you're going to get the particular action you're interested in. So you can't rely on that. So you can think of there being a continuum for data analysis. So up at this end is this observation of naturally occurring data. You just collect conversational data and you see what's there. At the other end is something like doing an interview with people who were interacting. So like you have them interacting, but then you're analyzing an interview that you did with them, reflecting on their process of interacting. And in between, you have different ways to go about collecting and analyzing the data. And in the middle here is something called the discourse completion task. And this is something that has been used widely in pragmatics because you can collect lots of data and you can control for who you collect the data from, and you can control the context. So it's very much controlled. The problem is it doesn't have the validity that naturalistic data has. So this is what you do. You have a situation, you give somebody a situation, and maybe part of a dialogue or a full dialogue, and then you have them complete or give the next action for that dialogue. And like I said, you can collect a lot of data and you can control for age and status, and then you can quantify. You can have statistics. Woohoo! So this would be one thing. So I would like you to just send this to me in a private chat, and I'll collect this. So just send it just to me. So I don't want you to share your answers because I don't want you to influence one another. So this is the situation, and this comes from an actual test. So you get these directions. Read the following situations. Some situations, more than one response is appropriate. Write down all the responses that are provided. Okay, so here there are 4 lines. I guess you could put 4 responses if you want to. And then, yeah, it says don't discuss the questionnaire before filling out. So the question is, your best friend approaches you and you say, you see they are wearing a new hat that you really like. What do you say? So see how this gives you your best friend. So you have some sort of relationship knowledge, status. Okay, so equal status, very close, your best friend. And it's a hat. And then what do you say? So very open-ended. Right.
Are you enjoying all of us complimenting you on your nice hat?
I am. I wish I was wearing a hat, then I would just take it personally. Okay, now hopefully it will save this. Do you notice it saved private chats?
I don't
And
think
then-
so.
Oh, okay. Then I'm going to do a screen capture.
I think if you, once you end the meeting, you should get like a transcript of all of the chats. I'm wondering if it'll save once it ends, maybe.
Well, that's what I mean. I always get the chat, but I don't remember if I get private chats sent to me, you know, if those that get saved. But anyway, I'll try it. Okay. So I'll collect those, hopefully. Another way to do this is, or sometimes a follow-up, so you get all the responses, and then you choose the top 4 responses, and so you do that with one group of people, like as your, you know, preliminary research, and then you get top 4 responses, and then you do the study, you know, for real, or you do the study with another group of people, and you say choose one of these 4. So they have a forced choice. So already these are 2 interesting options. Open-ended, they can say whatever they want, or you give them a forced choice. And then the idea is, for all of these questions, you can get a controlled set of answers and then make some kind of generalization. Like, this is the way people do this in US American English. Yeah, so the issues. So this would be the Etic perspective. So the outsider, the analyst, is bringing the data, you know, the framework for the data, and using like previously defined theory to design all the questions, and then you count those up and you can generalize because it's based on a theory. According to this theory, this is how people do whatever the speech act is. So yeah, the issue is putting too much emphasis on how well this is controlled. So, okay, it may be controlled, but controlled what? It seems like for the critic like me, so I'm critical of this research. For the critic like me, it's you have a controlled, it's very well controlled, but it's not naturalistic. So how valid are the results? That's the basic criticism of DCTs. So can collect lots of data, can control the situation very well, but the question is it valid? Would you want to base your use your results to teach somebody? Okay. Okay, we're finished for today. So on Wednesday, we'll talk about complement responses in Arabic and do closings. And I'll hang around for another 5 minutes or so if you have questions. Otherwise, I'll see you Wednesday.
Thank you. See you Wednesday.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. I have a small comment that I
Yeah.
wanted to make.
Yeah.